In the subterranean chamber of the Great Pyramid, there's a deep vertical pit that's been cut into the floor. Today, this unexplained man-made cavity is largely filled in, but it remains the focal point of this unfinished chamber. In recent weeks, you may have seen that this pit has been mentioned more and more, and this is ever since the controversial Khafre SAR project reached the world's media. And of course we know why, because claims have been made that enormous cylinder-like features have been detected beneath the Khafre Pyramid, and they apparently extend down for hundreds of meters into the bedrock. There is even talk of a lost city beneath the Giza Plateau. So, with that in mind, you can see why a deep pit, a vertical shaft in the basement of the Great Pyramid, is getting attention. Some claim it's the beginnings of one of the so-called giant cylinders, others say it's an entrance into a cave system, and even the alleged underground city. Tourists are not allowed to enter the pit. It's cordoned off. Authorities have filled it in. And now, together with the Khafre SAR data, it's all leading to what some are saying is a conspiracy. So, what's the truth? What do we actually know about this enigmatic pit in the bowels of the Great Pyramid? Well, in this video, you'll find out. Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe to the channel for regular content on ancient architecture, as well as all of the latest news from the world of archaeology. When researching any aspect of the Great Pyramid, I always find it best to start with the writings of Howard Vyse. It's usually the perfect starting point, because he gave a fantastic and detailed description of the Great Pyramid as he found it in the mid-1830s. And no, he wasn't the first to write about the pyramid, and he was also not the last. But in the modern era, he probably gives us the best and earliest thorough description of the Great Pyramid. And yes, nearly 200 years has passed since Vyse worked at Giza, but trust me when I say that a lot can change in that time, especially with careless modern renovation, which often gets conveniently unmentioned. One example is the filling of the Great Step at the top of the Grand Gallery, which effectively removed what was, I believe, an important original feature of a functional space in the Great Pyramid. Thankfully, photographs do exist. But anyway, I always find it best to start with the writings of the historic antiquarians, instead of picking up a modern book, because they recorded details that are often overlooked today, or, in the grand scheme of things, are considered insignificant by Egyptologists. A lot of the modern pyramid books don't even include the Subterranean Pit. For example, I can't see a single reference in Mark Lehner's The Complete Pyramids, and I think that this just helps to fuel the conspiracy theories, because the information is not at hand. So yes, in my opinion, it's best to start with the writings of Howard Vyse, and at the beginning of his book, Operations Carried On at the Pyramids of Giza Volume 1, he mentions that the subterranean chamber was open, and, quote, "In the floor of the subterranean apartment, an excavation has been made to a depth of a few feet," end quote. I then found another mention in Vyse's Volume 1 saying that on the 22nd of February 1836 he met Giovanni Caviglia in Alexandria. Caviglia said that he made the excavation in the subterranean chamber, and this would be when he was working for Henry Salt back in 1817. He said to Vyse he didn't think there was any kind of apartment beneath it, but the specific words written by Vyse make the history of the subterranean pit unclear. When Caviglia said he made the excavation in the subterranean chamber, was he merely saying that he excavated the chamber, removing the loose stones, rubble and rubbish, which we know he did when employed by Henry Salt? Or is he implying that he created the pit in the floor, that he actually quarried the limestone bedrock, that it's not an ancient feature and it is actually very recent. And for Kvillia, such destructive investigative work was not uncommon. He created the large tunnel just north of the King's Chamber when he was following the path of the Northern Air Channel. You can see inside this tunnel in a video I made recently, and I've linked it below in the description. I next turn my attention to the memoir on the pyramids and Sphinx by Henry Salt, who writes about his work at Giza with Giovanni Kvillia from 1817 to 1818. Salt explains that Kvillia excavated the blocked descending passageway, and so he was the first person in the modern era to reach the subterranean chamber. When discovered by Kvillia, it was almost entirely filled up with loose stones and rubbish, and alongside a number of Egyptian labourers, Kvillia worked to remove it. Salt then visited the chamber, and he notes how it measured 46 feet in length and 27 feet in width, that the excavation was somewhat irregular, but it did have a flat roof. Salt also noted the excavation in the central part of the eastern end, which he said was 5 foot lower than the chamber floor. It looked like a hollow, and in the middle of this hollow, it looked like there were the beginnings of a well. From the words of Salt and Vyse, it still wasn't clear if the hollow and the pit in the centre were always there, or whether this was the work of Kvillia. But logically, I would suggest the former, that the hollow and the hole were always cut into the bedrock, long before Kvillia entered, and that Kvillia did no more than clear the room and the pit of loose stones and rubble. It seems unlikely that Kvillia would have dug into the bedrock before Henry Salt was given the chance to inspect the newly cleared chamber and record its appearance in his memoirs. Now moving on to the Pyramids of Giza by John Shae Perring, published in 1839, and he confirms the excavation in the floor, stating it was 5 foot deep, and he says it was found when the apartment was opened by Kvillia. This therefore confirms my suspicion that Kvillia did not quarry it, but he merely cleared it. The pit was an original feature. Perring goes on to say that under the direction of Henry Salt, Kvillia enlarged the pit to a depth of 10 feet, and I would suggest that this implies he continued to clear out the rubble that filled it. But this was not the end of the pit excavations, because in the footnotes of page 199 of Vyse's Operations Volume 1, he mentions that one of the men he had employed, a man named Doward, continued to work in the pyramid after Vyse left Giza. Under the direction of John Shae Perring, Vyse said he was, quote, employed in sinking the shaft in the subterranean chamber of the Great Pyramid, end quote, and he writes that a depth of 36 feet was reached. In the writings of Perring he confirms the work, saying, quote, the excavation has been considerably enlarged and sunk to a great depth, end quote. For some more information, we next turn to the work of Flinders Petrie. He notes the shape of the shaft in the middle of the hollow as being square, but with sides not parallel with the chamber. It was set diagonally. He says the best worked floor surface in the whole chamber is just around the square shaft, which we now know was there before Kvillia entered in 1817. Apparently, the southeastern and southwestern sides, highlighted here on this diagram, go down by 67 inches or 170 centimetres, leaving a ledge about 20 inches wide or 51 centimetres. The second part of the shaft goes down a lot deeper, and the deeper part is on the northern side, as marked on this diagram. According to Petrie, he says the original square shaft, the part excavated by Giovanni Kvillia, was in fact ancient, but Perring of course extended it. Petrie says that this extension is around 30 feet deep, which differs to the 36-foot measurement given by Vyse, but he notes there was water in the bottom, water from heavy rainfall that washed down the descending passageway. I think now would be a good time to recap what we know, because whilst most things seem straightforward, there is still one important thing that remains unclear. So, to recap, in 1817, Cuvillier excavated the descending passageway and subterranean chamber of the Great Pyramid. He found there was a hollow in the ground with a square shaft in the middle, and it went down for around 5 feet. Cuvillier would continue excavating down as far as 10 feet, removing all the rubble, sand and rubbish. No chamber was found underneath. Then in 1838, John Shae Perring and his men extended the pit vertically, so the bottom was now 36 feet lower than the chamber floor. As far as we know, nothing of note was found at the bottom. And whilst this all sounds reasonable, what we don't know is whether or not Perring and his men quarried 36 feet down into the bedrock when they extended the pit, or simply excavated 36 feet of loose rubble, sand and stones that had filled an existing deep pit. So, how can we find out? Well, unless we can inspect the pit up close and in person, and look at the specific quarrying methods and techniques, I guess there is no real way of knowing for sure, and today this is next to impossible, because the pit is largely filled in. But in the early 20th century, the brilliant Edgar brothers gave their own opinion. They are known for making very credible, reliable and detailed observations of the Great Pyramid, and they believe the deep shaft excavated by Perring and his men was not an original part of the pyramid, and that it was in fact quarried out by Perring. When doing a clean-up job to record the western end of the subterranean chamber, the Edgar brothers even threw sand and small stones down the pit, because they say, quote, "We have no hesitation in doing this, as the bottom 36 feet or so of this shaft is no part of the original design of the pyramid, but is a comparatively modern excavation by Mr. Perring." End quote. They continue by saying, quote, "The upper end of this shaft, however, is evidently part of the pyramid's original design, and we therefore refrained from filling up this part. The ancient builders cut a square shaft for a depth of 7 feet below the level of the highest projection of the uneven floor of this eastern part of the chamber, and from the bottom of this another but smaller square shaft for a further depth of 3.5 feet. The larger shaft is approximately 6 feet 6 inches square, and its sides lie nearly diagonally to the sides of the chamber. The smaller shaft, which is about 4 feet 6 inches square, proceeds downward from the north corner of the larger one, the northeast and northwest sides of both being continuous." End quote. They finish by saying, quote, "From the bottom of this smaller ancient shaft, Mr. Perring sunk his irregular rounded excavation." End quote. So, there was a clear change in stone cutting or quarrying techniques, and the Edgar brothers who saw the pit firsthand certainly believed the deeper part was not an original part of the pyramid. Charles Piazzi Smythe also confirmed that Perring and his men cut through the bedrock. But why did Perring dig? What exactly was he looking for? Well, he tells us by saying, quote, "To ascertain whether or not any chamber existed on the level with the waters of the Nile." End quote. And this, I'm sure, is all because of the writings of Herodotus, the grandfather of history, who in his Histories Book 2 talks of the building of the Great Pyramid, and specifically the underground chambers and the king's intended burial place, which, when the pyramid project was complete, was allegedly surrounded by water brought in by a channel connected to the Nile. The water encircled an island on which Khufu was apparently buried. Whether or not this is true, we don't know. For all we know, Herodotus could have been told about the Osiris shaft, and wrongly believed that this was below the Great Pyramid. Either way, the writings of Herodotus would have been known by the 19th century explorers, and so there would have been great interest in the subterranean chamber, and a good reason to excavate down, to try and reach the groundwater and hopefully an undisturbed tomb. But as stated by Charles Piazzi Smythe in 1867, Perring meant nothing but solid and dry rock. They did not reach the water table. So, after all of this, I think we now have a clearer understanding of the pit, and I think the evidence suggests there isn't anything to get excited about. The deep parts of this pit, the crude extension, looks to be the work of John Shae Perring and his men, and they gave up without finding anything. But what about the top part? The square-cut upper pit that both Petrie and the Edgar brothers believed was an original part of the pyramid. Interestingly, Petrie compared it to the subterranean chamber in the mastaba of Ti, an amazing tomb located at Saqqara. You can do a virtual walkthrough at this mastaba online, and I've left a link below. And in September 2023, I was lucky enough to go inside and explore myself. At this Old Kingdom 5th Dynasty tomb, there is also a square pit cut into the floor. It's larger than the one we find in the Great Pyramid, but interestingly, it's also set diagonally, so its sides are not parallel with the walls of the room it's in. As you go down this pit, you enter a corridor, and this leads to a burial chamber. The Old Kingdom sarcophagus is still inside. So, back to the Great Pyramid, and if we run with the idea the subterranean chamber was maybe a contingency, in case the chambers within the Great Pyramid actually failed, well, I like the idea put forward by Petrie, that the pit could have been part of the original plan, and like in the mastaba of Ti, it could have been the entrance to an unfinished burial chamber below. But of course the work was unfinished and abandoned, maybe because the pyramid grew in size and the king's chamber was complete and was a success. Therefore, work in the subterranean chamber came to an abrupt end. Another possible interpretation for the pit is that maybe it was dug to be a kind of drain or soak pit, maybe added right at the end of the Great Pyramid project. As Petrie noted, after a heavy rainstorm, water had gotten into the pyramid, cascading down the descending passageway and ending up inside the pit. So maybe the pyramid builders added a soak pit, a place to collect potential rainwater, which would eventually dissipate through the porous bedrock below. I personally prefer the first explanation, that we are in fact looking at the beginnings of a lower burial chamber, much like we see at the mastaba of Ti. Whatever the truth, hopefully what I've shown in this video is that information is out there if we're willing to look hard enough. All the books I've mentioned are free to view online at archive.org, and the words of the historic explorers have allowed us to dispel the rumours that in the Great Pyramid there is a subterranean connection to an ancient cave system or lost city, or that the pit is somehow linked to an enormous cylinder below the pyramid. We know there is a deep excavation, but it was mainly dug in the 1830s. But there is still mystery within the Great Pyramid, because before the 1830s, there was a square-cut 10-foot deep pit in the subterranean chamber, and we don't know exactly when or why it was made. All we can do is make calculated suggestions with the information at hand, and so I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.